Refresh tokens, as you probably already know, are used to refresh access tokens. What you probably really want to know is, are you using them properly? There are two main ways that you can really use refresh tokens. One, storing them in the database and then refreshing them in the background. And then two, you are going to trigger the refresh of the access token as you're making a request to that external endpoint. In this video, we're going to be obtaining our access tokens and refresh tokens and building out both of the examples against the Patron API. A big disclaimer, I'm not going to be explaining most of the stuff I'm going to be putting in the add auth function. If you're not familiar with auth in ASP.NET Core, go watch my previous videos, please, as I'm not going to be explaining most of that stuff. Otherwise, welcome to the Raw Coding YouTube channel. My name is Anton. Let's take a look at this. As I mentioned, I'm not going to be explaining most of the stuff, and that's because we have quite a beefy example, and if you've watched my previous videos, you should understand most of the stuff that is going on over here. We're setting up cookie authentication with Patron external authentication. We have all of our configuration in the Patron auth configuration, right? So client ID, client secret, all the endpoints. I have gone ahead, set up my account. I've gone through the documentation. I've got the endpoints and I've just put them into my application, right? So the standard thing that you would do when you're setting up auth. I've gone through the documentation, I identified the claim that I'm going to need to get user information, which is what we're going to be doing, and then I'm hooking on the onCreatingTicket event, get my database, request user information, get the patron ID, store the patron ID in the database, and against that patron ID, I'm going to be saving this token information. Patron identifier for the user that is trying to sign in. We're storing the access token, the refresh token, and the expiry time. So when the token expires, that expiry time, we're also storing it in here. So 3 pieces of information against the patron ID. We're then adding the patron ID to the identity in the context. That means once we actually go through the callback of the auth flow, this claim is going to be present in our claims principal. We then have 2 simple endpoints. Home endpoint, where we're just taking a look at the claims that are currently present in the claims principal. And then we have the login endpoint, where we're just initiating the auth authentication with Patron. Quickly taking a look at the token database. All we're doing is loading records from a file, so this dictionary string token information. Anytime we read and write, this is always synced with the file. And then for the token information, we have the access token, refresh token, and the expiry time. Okay, so that's the whole setup. Just to get you in the zone, let's place a breakpoint over here and go through this logic. I will place it maybe somewhere over here near the patron ID. The application, which is already running, we shouldn't have any cookies, and we don't. Let's go to the login endpoint. This is going to redirect us to Patron. If I allow, this is going to redirect us back to callback, and I haven't touched the debugger. So we just gone ahead and obtained the patron ID, and I guess let's scrap the breakpoint, as you probably should already know what is happening here. Here we get an access token with a refresh token and also the expiry time. So we've obtained our tokens, stored it in the database, all good. So the first thing to take a look at is background refreshing. We have the tokens in the database. Let's just run some kind of logic on a schedule. Query the database. Is the thing about to expire? If yes, go ahead and fetch a new thing. So this is not so much a question about how do you do refreshing of tokens. This is more about how do you do scheduling in ASP.NET Core or other programming languages. Here we can use a background service, we can do hangfire, we can use many things. I'm just going to go ahead and opt in for a background service. Let's go ahead and create a new class. We'll call it token refresher. This is going to inherit from a background service. Let's go ahead and implement it. Because this is going to be a singleton and most of the services that we want to bring in, we will need to do it for the iService provider. Get the fields initialized, infinite while loop going with catching any error that might happen, so we keep refreshing the tokens. It's best to create a scope from which we're going to be dragging these services. So in here, there will be another service provider. And mainly, we will be taking a look at the database. So get required service, token database, var db. Then we're going to get all the tokens. So db, we have all the records. This is going to read it in. And now let's look for tokens that are about to expire. We will spawn a for each loop. So for all of the tokens, let's grab the patron ID and comma, delete this variable. This is going to be token information. Now, if you read the auth spec, and sometimes documentations will remind you how to refresh tokens, all you have to do is re-hit the token endpoint, specify your client ID and client secret, specify the grant type to be a refresh token, and then also set the user's refresh token. Now, if you're familiar with the auth handler, you already know that it is doing the posting to the token endpoint internally. So we can actually just go in here, find the exchange code async logic, and just say, this here, where you are doing the posting of the auth code to the token endpoint, let's just take this logic and, well, repurpose it. We'll go into the token refresh over here, and we will say if token info expires, subtract, let's say date time, again UTC now. This is going to give us a time span, and if this is less than 1 day, then we want to go ahead and try to refresh the token before it actually expires. Now, I'm going to try to write this logic a little bit more reusable. This is going to be a refresh token context. This is where the refreshing of the token is actually going to happen. When I create this service, I will need to make a call. For this, I'm going to need an iHTTP client factory, which is going to create my HTTP client. Then finally, I will need to refresh a token. So public, for now, we can just call it task and refresh token. Place all the logic that we've stole over here, and for the client ID and all of this, this is going to come from patron auth config. So for now, let's place this here, patron auth config. Same for the client secret. Code, we don't have the code. Redirect URI, we don't have it. Grant type is now going to be a refresh token, and redirect URI, we will just replace it with the refresh token. Make sure we spell it correctly. And now we need a refresh token, which can come from the token info. We'll just pass it to this function, replace this parameter with a refresh token, and all good. So PKC, this is only valid when you're doing the auth code exchange, so we can just remove it from here. Form URL encoded parameters are going to be these ones, and this is fine. I'll just remove this exclamation mark. The token endpoint, this can come from the patron auth configuration as well. For the other stuff, this is fine. The back channel that's coming from the options, as we know, this is just an HTTP client. So let's actually create the HTTP client over here. Underscore HTTP, call create client from here, create a field, and instead of back channel, let's use HTTP. We will make this function asynchronous, and by the end, we can actually return an auth token response. So let's say auth token response. We can also pass a cancellation token. So let's say cancellation token CT, grab it, remove the request aborted stuff and pass the cancellation token. To abide with conventions, we can say that this is refresh token async as well, and get rid of this stuff. For checking if this is unsuccessful, we don't care. We are riding the green wave over here, okay? Here's our refresh token context. Let's surface this service just like this. So again, refresh token context. We'll call it as such as well, refresh token context. Here we can go to the refresh token context, refresh token, pass the token information with a cancellation token. So stop in token comes right there. We can await on this, and there is going to be a result. We will need to await on this. And from program CS, we already have the logic for saving the tokens back into the database, which we can place over here. The database is going to be the DB. So DB save from the result. There is going to be the access token, the refresh token, and also the expires in. The token response is the same as this. So because we've just lifted this code, this token response would be the object that is contained here, right? So result.expires in, all of this information is here, right? This would just automatically re-refresh the token in the background as soon as it attempts to expire. Currently, because this is an infinite loop, it's just gonna go drrrr. What we want to do is give it a little bit of a timeout. You maybe want to do it like once a day or something. We will actually delay it for 1 second, so we don't have to wait for too long for the purposes of the video. Let's also pass the cancellation token here. Let's take the refresh token context. We will move it into its own class. Grab the refresh token context, come back to program CS, and let's start adding these. So add transient refresh token context. We will add HTTP client, which is going to give us the iClient factory. And then we will also want to add a hosted service, which is going to be our token refresher. So this is the background service that we're hooking up. How do we test this? We can actually go to the token refresher. We can put a iLogger in here. So iLogger of token refresher. This is going to be a logger, comma over here. Logger just like that. And let's say that we are refreshing a token. So log information. And I'm going to use an interpolated string. Don't kill me for this. Refreshing token for, let's say, patron ID. Okay, so hopefully the application should restart. There it is. So what I'm going to do as this hosted service is working in the background, because we already have the tokens in the database, so I will just pull this back to November, save the file, and we should see a log. The token is refreshed. If I take a look at the file again, there we go. Expiry time has been amended as well, and well, we're not gonna see it, but the access token has been changed as well. Something that we're not going to do here, and potentially what could be a little bit expensive, is instead of checking the expiry time, or in addition to checking the expiry time, you just make a quick call to some kind of endpoint, user information endpoint, and as long as you don't get a 401 or 403 or something like this, you're good. Now for the second implementation, we are gonna add another endpoint where we want to call patron for its user information. For this, I'm just gonna add a info endpoint. We will give this a body. And when you're calling external APIs, you are going to have some kind of client. Let's go ahead and add a patron client. This is going to need a HTTP client in the constructor. So HTTP client, let's just call this HTTP, create the field. This is going to be a client that we should be able to inject. So on here, we're gonna add an HTTP client, give it this type, and now we can grab patron client, inject it into here, patron client. Remember that if we actually want to reach our access token to make the request to their API, we need our claims principal to get the patron ID claim. So I'll format this. I will get the patron ID claim. So patron ID, user, find first value, patron ID, semicolon on the end. And then I'm going to go to patron client. I will return and call something like get info. This method doesn't exist yet, so I'll just grab the name, come over here, create a public string get info. And here we are just going to be making a similar request to this, where we're just going to read the content just like that and return it as well, making the method asynchronous, so just importing that. Now, access token, user information endpoint, let's just make sure that we're getting the user information endpoint from our configuration over here. We don't have access to the auth options. Backchannel is replaced by the HTTP client that is going to be injected. To get the access token, in addition to the HTTP client, we can actually bring in our token database here. So just token database, create a field, and from this token database, we will extract the access token. And you can have caches here, you can have read-through caches, you can do many things, okay? We will want to get some kind of token information from the database, and what we get it by is the patron ID. We'll pass it through to the function, we'll grab the token information, and that's where we will extract the access token from. Now, coming back to program CS, all the way back to this method, all we're going to do here is pass the patron ID. The application should restart. We'll come back over here and let's just make sure that we can actually reach info. This makes a request to the patron API and returns the same information as it does in this place, right? We're just calling that endpoint. If our token would expire, or let's say I would grab the token and change it a little bit and then refresh, I am now unauthorized, okay? What you really want to do in this situation is use the refresh token to go ahead and fetch a new access token, reappend it to the request, and retry the request. And when you hear the word retries, don't go implementing your own retry logic, use poly. And that's what we're going to be doing in this situation. Let's open up the NuGet Manager, and here go ahead and type in Poly. You can find Poly. I am looking for Microsoft extensions.http.poly. Let's go ahead and add that. Drop down the NuGet Manager. Let's close the database, and this package that we've just added, what it gives us is on the add HTTP client, we can now add a policy handler. We have a couple of overrides over here, so let me try to use the patron client and generate handle unauthorized. No function generator, so let's generate a property that is going to be my return type. Otherwise, I want to make this a function. This is going to be static, and I'm actually just going to put this at the bottom. Coming back to program CS, this is not going to fit one of the signatures that is required here, and because I'm going to be working with the database, I actually want a service provider, which is what I can get here. So I can have a function signature of service provider and HTTP request message, and then the same return type. Okay, let's come back to patron client, and we will add these two parameters. So I service provider, this is going to be a service provider, and then an HTTP request message, and this is just going to be a request. From this function, we will then return a regular policy. So we will go to policy and we will handle a result. The result that we're going to be handling is an HTTP response message. Okay, so our client is going to be making a request. We're getting back an HTTP response message, and this response, what it's going to have is it's going to have a status code. So here, status code. And this should equal to unauthorized. I know this returns a 401 and it's called unauthorized instead of unauthenticated, and then 403 gives you a forbidden, which should be unauthorized. It's a little bit confusing, but there we have it. So we will handle this result, and how do we want to handle it? We want to have a retry async, and because this is a token refresh operation, we want to refresh it once or retry it once, and while we are retrying it, we will need some kind of exception and the attempt count over here. Then we want to execute this lambda. If you're confused at this point and you've never used Poly, we're basically looking for a response message with the status code, and then we're going to retry it once, and then for the one time that we're retrying it, we're going to execute this logic, and then the request will be made again. This lambda is our opportunity to refresh the access token and reattach it to the request that we're passing over here. We've already created a refresh token context. Let's surface it from the service provider. So let's create a scope, var scope, using at the start. From the scope, service provider, let's get required service. This is going to be a refresh token context, var refresh token context. Here we want to take refresh token context and refresh a token, and we need to supply token information and a cancellation token. Cancellation token, we don't have one, so let's just specify none. And for the token info, we will need a database. So let's just get our database. This is going to be token database here. From the database, we want to get by the patron ID. Where is the patron ID? How can we get it in here inside the static function? So let's follow the trail. We are calling this information endpoint. The patron ID is contained on the claims principal. We pass it to the function. We go into the patron client. This request is being made. At this point, after the send async function, when it fails, this function is going to get triggered. The patron ID, the last time we see it is here. Somehow we need to get it from here to over here. Now, you can do it many ways. You can override the HTTP request message, basically extend it, put additional information in there, and then just cast it here and re-extract that information. I am maybe what might be considered a little bit dirty. I'm just gonna go ahead and add a patron ID header with a patron ID value. I will remove the rest over here, and then when this logic is going to get triggered, I will be able to extract the patron ID from the request headers get values. This is going to be patron ID and just the first value. I don't know why it's a list. The headers are key value pairs. I understand that they're semicolon separated, but I don't think that should be integrated into the HTTP client. var token info, let's extract that from the database, and probably if I needed multiple values over here, I would be like, oh, why do I need to dot split semicolon and trim every single time? Oh, maybe this is the lesser of all evils. But anyway, here we have the token info. I'm gonna place it over here and we're gonna get a result. I will await on it. This will be an asynchronous operation, and because we're refreshing a token, we wanna store it back in the database. So perhaps we don't want the logic for storing actually in the token refresher right over here. However, we do have the database at this point, so I'm actually just gonna copy because, you know, you're only gonna have one of these methods at a time. So patron client, let's go ahead, place this over here. The database is going to be just database, not DB. And again, we're just doing the same thing. We're just saving the tokens. And now for reattaching the bearer token to the request before it's going to be retried, and it's going to be the same request that is going to be retried, by the way. So we're just amending the state on the original request that is being passed over here. Now that we have this function is going to be registered with the HTTP client that we have over here, and it should handle refreshing tokens for us. Let's open up the terminal. The application has restarted. Let's go over here and we will refresh this endpoint. And we get the correct user information. I thought I saw it lag there for a second. And yeah, I'm noticing that we're reattaching the access token from the token information before we save it. So let's actually attach the access token from the result so it doesn't actually lag. Here, I'm just gonna re-amend the access token. The application should restart. I'm gonna come back over here and I'm just gonna refresh this. This should just give me a correct result and renew the token. So let's see, it starts with 8H. I will remove that, refresh, come back, and now it's a different thing. Okay. And that's essentially it. 2 ways to refresh your tokens, either in the background or as you're making these requests. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, click the notification bell, check out my shop. I'm now actually selling t-shirts, pretty excited about that. If you have any questions, leave it in the comment section below. If you want to say thank you, also leave it in the comment section, but better yet, come support me on my Patreon channel. Get the source code. Very big thank you to all of my current Patreon supporters. Your help is very much appreciated. Hope you have a good day and thank you for watching.